Hey guys, welcome back to Houdini Who Don't Know Season 2 Episode 4, and in this video I'm going to show you guys how to create this effect that you see on screen now. So some time ago I created a hair shading demo. I created an Instagram story and seems like you guys have an overwhelming response over here, so I think this is a good time to cover this topic. This is a fairly straightforward effect, but I think it's quite effective, and it also introduces you guys to how to create hair in Houdini. And there are a lot of little caveats and tricks that we need to look out for when shading hair, so I'm trying to cover that in this video here. This is kind of fun, right? There's some hair and some little water droplets on top of this setup here, and it's fairly easy to build, so I think this will be fun and I hope you guys enjoy this video. Actually, I've already laid out the steps over here, but I'm gonna run through and recreate this entire setup over here. Well, let's make some analysis on this first. Okay, so there is the ground plane, and we're extruding some hairs on the ground here, and then we're pinning the roots to the ground. And it's like we make some noise and wind motion, then we drop some little water droplets on top and generate some actual hairs to render, and that should be it, right? Probably the only tricky thing in terms of simulation to do is to try to make the little droplets balance on top of the fur coat over here, right? And then the rest should be fairly straightforward, so let's dive into the chalkboard to explain. It seems like this format of explaining seems to be quite useful for some of you guys. One of you mentioned that having explained it on the blackboard, you guys are interested to try it even without looking at the Houdini setup, right? So I think that's kind of fun for you guys to take this challenge up upon yourselves, right? So let me explain how we're going to approach this. So first we'll need a grid, and then we'll scatter some points on the grid, and we'll create some furs over here. And so on top of this, we're going to configure this as hair and also start to establish some water droplets. So let me just make a copy of this here. Start to place some water droplets here of varying sizes. And then we'll also configure these balls to be little water droplets, so maybe a little bit squishy droplets. And then we'll just run the simulation, and that's where we will get the output that we're looking for here. Okay, perhaps the only other thing to mention here is that when we're configuring the hairs here, we gotta make sure that the stiffness of the hair is of a certain gradient. So this is the band stiffness. So that's stiff at the bottom and less stiff at the top. And also I forgot to mention that we have to pin all these points. Pin. So let me label the steps. So once again, running through the setup, we have made a grid over here, scattered some points over here using the Vellum configure hair, so we get some points for us to simulate, and then we need to pin the starting points, and then we can prepare some droplets over here and also configure the bend stiffness of each of these hair strands to be tight at the bottom and less tight at the top, and then we can run the simulation. Right, there's one more step after this. This is the mid-res geometry, so this is low res. We need to drive the actual hairs, which is the high res. So this is step 7 here. We need to drive the high res resolution hair. Okay, so that's the notes for this episode. It's fairly straightforward, so let's build this in Houdini. Here we are in Houdini, and I've got a fresh scene here with the usual empty setup node and the camera node. So I'm going to dive into my setup node and create a setup over here. And in this example, I'm just going to create 100 frames as usual, and I'm going to drop down a grid. So this grid by default is 10 by 10 units. I'm just going to use 1 by 1 unit here. So it's manageable scene scale. And I'm going to use the hair generate node to generate some hair curves. And this by default defaults to 1000 curves. So I'm going to reduce that to 200. And also going to make the hair length over here to 1, so that it's looking like a cube over here. Next, I'm just going to drop down a Vellum configure hair that configures the hair properties over here, and drop down the Vellum solver node and put my display flag on the Vellum solver node, and I can run the simulation now. As expected, it falls through the ground because I don't have a ground plane over here. So let me just stow away the shelf tool over here to get some more screen real estate. Inside here, the Vellum solver, there is a checkbox conveniently located here called ground position. So if I check that on, it creates a ground plane. And if I run the simulation again, at some point, it will fall after the computer detects some motion inside the simulation, and then it will cause the hair to fall. But first, I don't want it to fall entirely. Second, I want to turn off this visualization display grid of the infinite ground plane. This is just a personal preference. So let me select the node, go to visualize, and turn off show collision. Next, I'm going to attempt to pin the start points over here, and to do that I need to isolate the start points. So I can do that by using a resample node. Instead of the primary function of the resample node, which is to resample the curves, I will turn off that option and turn on this curve view attribute. So this gives a curve view attribute from 0 to 1 based on the start point to the end point of the curve. So with that, I will drop down the group expression node, and I can say that I want a point group, the group type set at the points, and my group name shall be starts, and I'll type the condition at curve view equals to 0. the double equal sign denotes a condition. So with that, you can see in the viewport that the first point on the curves are all selected. I can create another condition here, call it ends, and I can copy this and say that when curve view equals to 1, it also creates another point group called ends. And it might not display in the viewport here, but if I click on this display group and attribute list and go to my selection tool, hit on the point selection mode, I can see I've got my endpoints and start points groups over here. Okay, so the group selection is done, hit escape, and then I can continue my setup here by going to develop hair node. In terms of configuring the hair, there is this convenient pin to animation rollout over here. I can choose to pin the start points, and with that I can run the simulation again. Not too different except that my start points are now pinned, and it also preserves some root direction over here. It's a bit hard to tell, yeah, but you can see that the start point is pinned. It also prevents the second point from moving too much because it's pinned to the root. And also it's not playing back real time. You can see now that it's cached, it's playing back a little bit fast, and that's because the real time toggle is not turned on. So look at the bottom left of your screen. There's this real time toggle over here. Turn it on, and then you can see it play back in real time. So it's falling a little bit too fast, and it seems like the bend stiffness is a little bit too low. But before I start tweaking the bend stiffness, I'm just going to hop into the Venom solver and create some forces. So double click on it, dive inside, and create pop force node. Wire it into the force output here, and under the noise tab, turn on amplitude, and you can run the simulation. So it's pretty okay, but there is still a gravity of -10, just based on the solver's default. So maybe I can fight that by putting upward force of 10, and we can see this moving in the wind. Yeah, so that's actually pretty okay for defaults. Maybe just a little bit stiffer or a little bit stronger noise amplitude will help. So I'm just going to give it 2 noise amplitude and a swirl size of 0.5 to increase the frequency of the noise pattern that undulates in this simulation. So we can see more moving patterns here. So I think the amplitude of 1 is okay. The swirl size, I can reduce it to 0.25. And yeah, I'm getting a little bit more movement here. Okay, and you can see that the point count over here is not like super high. It's decent, but I think I can get a little bit more. So under this hair generate node here, is defaulted to 8 segments. I'm going to change it to 12 so that I get a little bit more resolution. I think that is okay, and yeah, I'm pretty much there. Let us dive back into the nodes and see where we are now. We've created the ground plane. Tick. We didn't do this approach, but we generated some hairs and we pinned the start points over here. We have created the noise pattern over here, and now we are here to control the bend stiffness. This is optional because if our simulation is going well, we don't have to do that, and then we are due to drop the balls here. So let's head over to the side over here, give it some space, and let's create a sphere and change it from polygonal mesh to polygon so that we get equal edge length, which is a little bit more friendly for simulation. And I'm just gonna create a copy of it and a copy to points node to copy sphere 1 onto the points on sphere 2. And this is what we end up with. And I'm gonna reduce the point count of sphere 2 and drop attribute randomize on sphere 2 to randomize the colors of the points here, so that the spheres that has been copied onto the points will inherit the point colors. And another attribute randomize node here to randomize the p-scale, which allows us to vary the sizes of the spheres. This is a one-dimension float attribute, so I'm going to change the dimensions to 1, and I'm going to change the minimum value of the size to 0.5 to 1. And there's a global scale of this p-scale attribute here. I'm just going to scale that down to something that doesn't cause any intersections here. And let me just ghost my hair generate here. I can see that it's sitting into the ground here, so that's not ideal. My template sphere here, I'm just going to size it down. So the template sphere, I'm just going to size down the sphere and also increase the height of a sphere so that it all deconflicts over here. Okay, so instead of copying exactly onto the points over here, perhaps what I can do is to scatter some points onto this sphere, maybe just 5 of them, then I can control the intersections this way. So versus copying exactly onto these points, I scatter some points onto this surface, so that allows me to change the global seed. So I can change, let's say I force the total scattering point count to 10 and there are some intersections, I can still change the global seed of this distribution to find one that doesn't intersect. So having scattered the points here and created the p-scale, there is still some intersection that goes on. That's because I'm determining the p-scale after I've scattered the points, so the de-intersecting function here under the relax iterations doesn't take into account the p-scale that happens after. So what we can do is, after randomizing the particle scale radius over here, we can still run a point relax node here and check the checkbox called relax in 3D space and just plonk it in there, and it runs 10 iterations of trying to de-intersect the points in 3D space. So perhaps I just need 1 iteration to de-intersect. it seems like it's doing a pretty good job. So now I can scale down my original sphere a little bit and perhaps size up my P scale just a little bit to the point where it doesn't intersect. And still overall, I would wish to scale down my sphere, something like that. And under the scatter node, I can still change my global seed to change a different scatter to find one that doesn't intersect. And I can increase my relaxed iterations to 2. But that does push it quite a bit out, so I can reduce my point radius scale ever so slightly to not push them out too far from each other. Perhaps I do need a taller sphere. Okay, so something like that. Okay, we can still adjust this later on, so let's move on with the setup here. On this sphere node, I can increase the frequency. That's the number of points on this sphere for better simulation resolution. And I'm going to configure this as some soft bodies. So I'm going to drop down Vellum, configure struts. So this creates a little blobby thing. Let's just put it into the Vellum solver here to see what happens. So one, it was intersecting with the ground plane, so that's an issue. So what we can do is to move this higher by putting a transform node. Then I can hit enter and move it higher, something like that, maybe off the screen, and allow it to fall. And it doesn't fall because right here, the pop force that was set up applies onto these hairs over here, and I might not want to affect the little droplets over here. So what I can do is to group them up. So under this balls node, I'm going to create a group. Just going to group all the points up in here. The group name shall be droplets, and group all the points. So I have a point group called droplets. And in my Vellum solver node here, I will say that the pop force only applies onto all the groups but droplet. So I'll type droplet here, I'll put an exclamation mark in the front to denote that I will operate on any point other than the points in the point group called droplets, right? So everything but droplets. So right now, the pop force will not operate onto these spheres over here. Okay, so they are bouncy, the default settings are pretty okay, so let's leave that alone, and we'll check that the Vellum solver and the force node still works on the hairs here. Yep, still does, so that's good. And so now I need to make sure that these two geometries are working in the same simulation to get them to interact with each other. And to do that, on both geometry streams, I need to Vellum pack them, merge it, and then unpack them and plug it into the solver. So let's do that. Vellum pack, and just it connects the geometry stream and constraint stream, and another Vellum pack node here. After they are both combined and packed up, we can merge them using a usual merge node. And now the solver requires the geometry stream and the constraint stream, but it seems like this merge node doesn't have that input or that output. So to get those two streams again, we need to drop down a Vellum unpack node. Then we can have access to the combined geo stream and the combined constraint stream. So on my Vellum solver, we can run the simulation now. Clearly, there's a little bit of problem here. We haven't controlled our bend stiffness. Also, the balls are probably a little bit too heavy. So I'll hop over to this Vellum cloth node here, and it has been set that the mass is 0.1, which is quite heavy over here. So I'm gonna just insert a few zeros in there, 0001, and let's run the simulation. As you can see, it's a little bit resisting falling through the hairs now. Let me add a couple more zeros, so 5 zeros in between now. Okay, I'm gonna leave this at 5 zeros in between and a 1 for now. It does push the hairs a little bit and it largely stays on top. Okay, but having lowered the density and the mass of these spheres over here, they don't squish like before, which I kind of like the look of the squishing at the end over here. So I'm just gonna go to the struts constraints here, which controls the strength of the volume preservation. And I'm just gonna lower this stretch stiffness of the struts constraint by 2 units, 2.1, and see what happens. It does squish a little bit more. Yep, it's right about there. Okay, so I do not want so many of the droplets to fall over the hairs over here, so we need to create some glue constraints. And I cannot create the glue constraints on this stream, nor this stream, because I need to do it where they are aware of each other in terms of the presence over here. So let me drop down the Vellum glue constraint, and if I highlight it, you can see that it establishes glue constraints between the hairs and the droplets over here. But actually, I do want the constraints only on the ends of these hairs over here and the droplets group. So lucky for us, we can specify which is our source and target for the glue constraints. So under the group type here, change it to points, and I can specify that I want the endpoints to target the droplets over here. So we can see that nothing happens because there is a maximum search radius of 0.1. So we can increase the maximum search radius so that they find each other. But there is a problem here because we don't actually want to establish these glue constraints before the simulation, because if we do that, then you can see that those glue constraints has been established there. So these two spheres are strangely pinning in space because we established the glue constraints here, and then we're not shortening the constraints or anything like that. So this is the constraint to use, but we need the glue constraints to re-evaluate every simulation frame, so we cannot establish it here. So we will use the same constraints node, but within the solver, so that it establishes the constraints as it's simulating. So we do that by dropping down a vellum constraint node in the vellum solver, and then changing the constraint type to glue and plug it into source here. The group type shall be points to points, and it's the same drill here from the end points to the droplets here. So I'm going to dial in the vellum constraints attributes over here, but in order for me to explain what all these sliders do, I think it's easier for me to do it on the outside where the simulation is not established. So if I drop down a vellum constraints node here and dive to glue and set the point types to ends and the droplets over here, and perhaps I can start by moving this transform node much lower. So I'm going to make a copy here. I'm just going to move this down until we establish some connections. So this is easy for me to explain to you what these parameters do, right? So I can establish more constraints by increasing these constraints per point, right? So like the default is 1 point can get 1 constraint. So maybe I can say 1 point gets 3 constraints, right? So this is one method. And to establish more constraints, increase my maximum search radius. So if I search for a larger radius here, this is based on world units from 0 to 1. So if I search for a whole 1 unit here, it's helpful because I know that this entire setup over here is the whole of 1 unit. If I search half the grid here, I should be able to find all the points that I need to find. And this simulation properties to perhaps detach a probability to not have some connections. And in the case of this setup, we can ignore the detached chances over here, right? So that is how the simulation properties work. What if I want some of the points to connect to some of these higher spheres over here, right? I can increase first the search distance to 2, so that's 2 units up, and I can increase the max search points to much higher so that it goes past the point count of these constraints here. But this is really strange to run prior to the simulation, because if I run the simulation now, you'll notice something weird because we established the glue constraints there, so they are now pinning in space, so that's really funky. So we do need to do the glue constraints in the vellum solver instead. I was just setting it up out here because there's some visual feedback that comes with doing it outside here. So let me plug this out and just keep it there in case I need to reference it again, and dive inside vellum glue constraints node, and a search radius of 0.25, a quarter of the grid here feels enough. And let's just try for 6 constraints per point, and let's see the constraints being established as it simulates. So it's not bad. And I'm just going to pull out the constraint stream over here, just create a null from the constraint stream and see what constraints are established. Right. So with that, as it's simulating, it establishes these constraints, and the rest of them, there are no constraints formed, right? As you can see from this null node over here. Perhaps I can drop a delete node, and perhaps I can specify which type of constraints to keep. If I keep only the stitch constraints over here, I can see that these are the constraints that are established. Okay, so now that I have this debugging setup over here, the null node here, we can see our constraints, and what's happening now is that it only establishes these connections on the creation frame and not every frame of our simulation. That's because inside here under vellum glue constraints, it's set to on the creation frame. So let me change that to every frame. So on every frame, it evaluates and attempts to create the constraints here. So that's pretty nice. And also, we previously set our max search radius to 0.25, and that establishes the constraints a little bit too far away, like that, as it's falling down. So interestingly, it helps because it's dynamically created as the simulation is running. We do not need to increase the max search radius as much, right? Keeping it a super low value, like 0.05 now, it allows us to establish the glue constraints when it's much closer to the hairs here. So let's see what that looks like now at 0.05. So that's quite helpful. So there is a problem with the simulation properties here, because this pop force applies only on the hairs, which is what I want, but I do want the noise to be applied onto the spheres also, to the droplets too. So I need to split up this pop force for this to be the noise, and for this other one to be the upward force. Once that is for the upward force, I will exclude the droplets, but turn off the noise, and the one that is for the noise, I will not exclude the droplets. and turn off the outward force. So splitting the outward force away from the noise pattern, that allows us to have some noises onto the spheres as well, while keeping the outward force only on the vellum hair. The problem with having the outward force on the spheres is that the spheres will then not fall onto the hair. Well, it feels like our bend stiffness on the hair is a little bit strong, so let's just start dialing in our hair bend stiffness. Okay, so the default is 0.001, which is quite stiff, and I think 0.001 is a good value for the roots over here, but I think it should taper off so that the top parts of this point can get a little bit less stiffness in the bend, so that we get a little bit more movement towards the top over here. So to do that, I can actually resample my curve hue attribute, which if I visualize it now for your understanding, it's this value that goes from 0 to 1 over here. So I can do an attribute remap to remap this curve hue attribute from curve hue to bend stiffness. What happens is on this vellum hair node, I can set this constraints to multiply by an attribute, to scale by an attribute, and it defaults to this attribute that's specified here as bend stiffness. So that is where I got this name over here. So I'm remapping curve hue to bend stiffness, and so now the bend stiffness of the root is 0 and the top is 1, so it's stiffer at the top. It's the reverse of what I'm looking for, but just for your curiosity, this is what it looks like. The top parts of the hair is a lot more stiff and the bottom is a lot less stiff. Quite an interesting behavior, but I do want this the other way, so let me flip it around. And just for our understanding, I'm just going to make a super dramatic curve here, so the bend stiffness drops off halfway through the length of the curve, and we can see where that tipping point is, right? You can see that it's all stiff here and it's all not stiff towards the top here. And you can see that this allows a lot of movement in the top half of the furs over here, which is what I'm looking for. So let's just not make so drastic and perhaps set both to B-spline, perhaps all the handles to B-spline, so that's all smooth curve throughout. And let me just spend a tiny bit of time tweaking the speed of the noise over here, because I felt it was okay at the start, but I think there's a bit too little movement for some reason after the balls come into play. Perhaps it's the glue constraints, I'm not sure. I think what is missing is we need a higher drop from the spheres here, right? So I did move this down a little bit earlier to explain the glue constraints, so I'm going to swap back my original node here, which I copied to the side. So I'm going to toss this and move this back here. And so dropping from a height probably will allow for a little bounce on top of the hairs here. And perhaps the strange thing is that the hairs don't seem to have any resistance after it gets hit by the spheres here. It's like it's not talking to each other, so I think that could be because I isolated the force from the droplets here. So if I disable the outward force entirely, then everything falls. I could then adjust the bend stiffness so that the hairs are moving without any upward force. So I'm giving up the idea of this upward force. Let me just toss it to the side. And in this hair here, I'm just going to increase the stiffness so that it doesn't fall. Yeah, I think 0.75 of 0.1 is good. So we are getting there. The little droplets are nice and soft, and then we are getting some resistance on this. So the problem here is I sold myself the idea of using the upward force, and that's not really helping. So I think this is a much better result here. And I do think I can increase the amount of noise that we have. So perhaps I can reduce the pulse length to 0.25. Increase the roughness here, so there should be quite a bit more movement in the noise. Okay, the balls seem a little bit too light to cause any kind of movement in the grass here, so I'm just going to go to the mass here of the balls and perhaps make the mass heavier so there's a bit more movement that happens when it contacts the hair, so you can entirely catch the spheres over here. That's nice, it's crushing our structure a little bit too much, but I like the interaction between the balls here, the fur catching the balls over here. So on my remap node, the minimum value is not 0, but maybe 0.25 is better. And I think I can prevent it from falling over by increasing the bend stiffness here. After dialing in the simulation properties, you can see here that the balls are touching the tips. There's the bounce that I was looking for when it hits the tips, and also the little strands of hair gets a healthy amount of resistance. And also the balls are quite squishy, right? So this is a fairly optimal result that I was looking for. And how did I achieve this? I started by reducing the little balls mass over here to this value here, so that they are generally lighter than the hair and hence less dense, so they generally float on top of the hair. And the next thing I did was on the bend stiffness here, of the hair, I set a value of 0.5, and then I scaled that value by this attribute remap here on this curve so that it's quite stiff at the root and it's looser at the end. But previously it was set to minimally a 0, so it was a little bit too loose, so I set a value of 0.05. This is a value by experimentation, and it seems to hold up quite well. The other thing that I think is quite a big one is I was observing the constraints over here. So I set up this constraints in case it wasn't clear. It's from the output constraint stream, this pink one over here. I added a delete node and then only keep the stitch constraints here. So basically it serves as a preview for the glue constraints that are generated by this node in the solver here. And it's still the same. I'm gluing my end constraints to the droplets. But one thing I did that was quite important was the default here, the max search radius. When I was doing it on the outside, I was establishing a larger search radius in order to show you guys how the lines connect from the endpoints to the droplets. But we don't want that as we are generating the constraints per frame. We want a very small search distance so that when the constraints are generated, they are very small like that. So we don't establish glue constraints when they are miles apart, right? Only when they are super close, and then we generate the constraints. So you can see visibly they look like they are touching the tips. So that is a big one. The other one is I mentioned we will not play with the chance of detachment of these constraints in this exercise. So without any detachment, I found that they tend to fall off the hair like that a little bit too much. Maybe I can halve the rate of detachment so that they don't have to follow the hairs all the way when it's bent like that. Having increased the detachment chances, it gave me a result that allows the droplets to stay closer to the tips and not pull the hairs over too much. So I'm quite happy with this result. Just make sure that the beads are lighter, make sure that the hair bend stiffness is well controlled, and ensure that the distance here, the maximum search distance here, is small enough to not create a weird result. Maybe it's helpful if I increase this to 1. So let me show you what that looks like. The constraints are established way before it actually hits the tips of the grass here. So there's some very strange behavior over here as the constraints try to keep its length, right? So we do need to keep this fairly low. So now the spheres are ready to render, but the hair needs to generate the actual hair. So let me do a split here from the geometry stream and split my droplets from the hair. So this will be a null, and I will call it out droplets. Color it green out of habit and just a visual representation of what I'm going to render. And this other one shall be called reference animated guides. And this shall be blue for stuff that I'm going to reference within the network. So here are the animated guides, and it has a lot of properties over here, simulation properties, which I don't actually need them. And sometimes they conflict with the actual hair generation that I'm going to do at the site. So I'll get to that in a short while. By the way, I made some notes over here so that you guys can follow along. And so right at the side over here, I'm just going to create my actual hair. So here is my grid, and here's my hair generate. I'm just going to make a copy of this too over here and increase the amount of hair to 1000. So that's 5 times more. And it has 2 other inputs here. One is guides and one is the animated skin. So thankfully our skin is just a flat grid on the floor, so we can ignore the third input. But for the second input, I can create an object merge node for organization and drag in the anim guide curves here. So this object merge now holds the anim guides over here, and I'll just plug this into guides. Let's cache this anim guides over here. So drop down the file cache node, place it in here. So I'll cache both the droplets and the guides for droplets and just run. Okay, so now that that has been cached, I have my animated guides here. I can turn off my template flag on my preview glue constraints. And let's just see that if the newly generated hair is following the guide curves. So it's great, it does, right? So this is more hairs now than the default 200. Now it's 1000 over here, or maybe 10,000, and they follow the guide curves here. So this is a good start. It's quite difficult for me to see each individual hair strand here, so I'm just going to drop down an attribute randomize and randomize each primitive based on its ID, the color, so that I can see per strand here. Can you observe that some of them static over there? Well, that's because under the hair generate node here, there is this tab that says grow unguided hairs. So in the areas where it's not in the proximity of some guides, it will grow some new hairs. So let's turn that off so that all of our hairs are moving here. The next thing we can do is to vary the length of each hair over here so that it doesn't look like a computer generated like that. So there is guide process set length. The primary use of this is to set the length of the guide curves, but in this case I'm just using it for the actual hair too, right? So instead of adjusting the length of the guide curves, I'm adjusting the length of the hair here. I'm not going to vary it very much, so there shouldn't be any contact point problems between the tips of the hair and the droplets, right? I'm just going to vary it very slightly, so let's set its mode to multiply and scale it, the method to be scale, and let's just randomize this a factor of like 0.8 to 1, so that some hairs are 0.8 the length and some are 1, maybe just 0.9. So just some slight randomization allows it to look a little bit more organic. Finally, there is also clumping, so if I type hair here, there's hair clump, and perhaps I should put this before, because I want to do the clumping before adjusting the aesthetics of the hair length. Here it says required skin, the guide 2 here, so let's plug that in. Maybe it's quite messy like this, so I'm just going to make another object merge and plonk it in like that. So this object merge, let's just make it clear that it's the animated guides, and this shall be my static skin. Just plonk it in like that so that there are no wires crossing over each other. So now with the hair clump node, they all clump together like this, and this is based on this clump size over here. So if we don't want it to clump at a size of 0.15, we can lower this to a more organic value over here, say 0.05, and I can blend between both. So let's do for now, 100% blend, because I'm going to show you this curling over here. Having established the general clump frequency, I can turn on curling and increase the noise amplitude so it curls each hair strand along its length like that. And you can see that by default, it doesn't have any amplitude at the root. That's denoted by this graph over here and has stronger amplitude at the tips, which is good for my case. It's just that I find that the frequency is too aggressive. So the frequency here is 5. Let's lower that frequency to 1 and just adjust the amplitude to see what's the effect we have on this. So just ever so slightly, some curling, I think it's good. So maybe 0.02. Yeah, I think this is a healthy amount. And something that is concerning is this exclamation mark over here. So let's click on it. It says that the guide input neither has a rest point or rest root primitive attribute. So let's give our guides here, this one, a rest point. So here are our guides. It has a lot of attributes, but it doesn't have a rest attribute, which is a reference point for when it's in this rest state, presumably for some computations that will happen within the solver, or maybe down the stream it can be a useful attribute. So let's just give it anyway. It's called rest position. Let's plonk it in here, and let's create a time shift node to freeze the first frame of this by removing the connections here, Control Shift click. So this is a frozen frame of the first frame. Let's put it as the second input. So this will be the rest position. We can see here now that there's a rest attribute here. So prior to that, there's no rest attribute here. Okay, so here is our hair generate. It's quite straightforward, and we can now render these hairs. So let's pick the green one and Alt drag and say that this is our alt fur. So with both selected, let's create our geometry nodes outside. So let's create a geo node here. One is called droplets and the other is called fur. And in droplets, let's drop down object merge and click on this icon here. Head over to setup and choose out droplets. And for fur, we'll do the same. Object merge, click here and merge in from the setup node, the fur. So we have both geometries over here. And let's set up our render cam. So let's look through the render cam here and lock our camera to the viewport by clicking this padlock icon. And just frame this up by spacebar F and choose a longer focal length, which I prefer. So maybe 80. Okay, I'm quite happy with this. And let's create a ground plane. Let's call it ground. And I'm just going to create some rotation here. So $FF on the null, multiply by 0.3. And that gives us a rotation that looks like that. I'm just going to minus off from this entire equation, 15 units. So it ranges roughly from minus 15 to 15. Of course, you could just hand key that. Right, and I'll just get some random motion on translation here. So on the translation, I'm just going to right click the channel there and go to Motion FX and Noise. So that gives me this crazy movement of the camera. I'm just going to reduce the amplitude to 0.1 so it looks like a handheld camera. And just reduce a little bit. So when I play back, it's trying to play back every frame by not skipping any frames. So I can right click here and switch from play every frame to maintain real-time playback, possibly skipping frames. So that allows us to see this as real-time as we can. So this is a good speed for me. Just reduce the amplitude by a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of nice. And let's just make sure that the object's rendered. So I'm just going to save this now. Okay, so if I kick off the render here, let's see what we have. We have no lights in the scene, so it defaults to the default light, which is very ugly. Let's drop down a redshift light dome and pick an HDRI that you like. And set its color space to scene linear rec 709-sRGB. and it looks quite strong, so I'm just going to reduce the exposure by 1. That's okay, and reduce the saturation by 50%, so it's not so yellow. And just going to do some transformations here. Maybe a light angle like this is okay to start with. Of course, I'm not making the assessment with the fur in place, so let's do that. So to render furs in Houdini, you have to go to the Redshift OBJ tab of your geometry, head over to Settings tab, and under another sub-tab called Render, turn on Render Polygons as Hair. So what happens is, you can now see the hair primitives over here. And then I can see that the sphere is not subdivided, so on the droplets here, head over to Redshift OBJ tab, head over to Tessellation and turn on Enable Tessellation and Enable Displacement. Okay, so that is all good. I don't like that this forming a straight line. It's forming this really weird illusion here. So let me rotate this light to break up that line a little bit. Maybe this way. Okay, let's go to the middle frame. Let's give it some materials. So head over to the Material tab here and drop down Redshift Material Builder and name one to be the droplets and one to be the fur. Droplets and fur, and perhaps one more for the ground. Just drag it into the viewport here. Okay, so for droplets, we just have to turn on the transmission to 1 and set its roughness to 0 on its reflection, and its IOR to 1.33 to mimic that of water, and yeah, that's about it. We can see some darkness in here, so let's head over to the Optimizations tab and potentially increase the reflection and transmission trace depth by twice, so that we get a bit more light passing through. So you can see here, for example, without the overrides, it seems to truncate in its computation. So if you increase the trace depth, then it allows multiple times for the reflections and refractions to pass through. Okay, so that's a good start. And now that I've given it the materials, I think the light was actually alright at the 0 exposure value. Next is in the fur node here, I will not use the standard material, but Redshift's hair material here. So there's a Redshift hair, don't use that, use Redshift principled hair and just plunk it into the surface color here. Click refresh and we can see the melanin based shader over here. However, we might want to vary the colors on our own. So to do that, let's not use the melanin based shader because we might not want natural hair colors but our own hair colors. So ignoring the melanin settings, we can turn on the albedo mix to 1. So that fully listens to the albedo color over here, which is this pale light orange here. So how do we get our own colors? We can drop down a Redshift random hair color and say let's choose a blue, and we can plug that into the albedo color here. So we get blue. And we can also, if I select this node here, we can choose to randomize the blue color. We can choose to adjust the saturation randomization and the value randomization, so some of them is darker. So let's just give it 0.25 of randomization for each slider, maybe for the hue slider less, so we get some variance over there. I think this is quite nice. And then I would like for the base of this to the tip to have some variance, so we can access that using the Redshift hair position. If I plug this scalar value into albedo, you'll see that's drawing a value of 0 to 1 like the curve hue attribute. So that's quite nice. I can use the color layer node to do some basic 2D operation here. So our base color goes in there and our 0 to 1 value goes in here. And let's change the blending mode to screen and put its out color back to albedo. So we are screening this white value on top of our hair colors there. And we can adjust this scalar value by using a ramp. In this case, I'll use a scalar ramp instead of a color ramp, so I can change both handles to B-spline and put in-betweens here to control the look of this tips of the hair to happen only at the tips, like that. So that it's not so linearly spread across, and I can ensure that the tips are really white, like that. So basically pulling a contrast curve, and that should result in this over here. So this is looking fairly nice as a color, but after feeding into the hair shader, it seems like we are losing a lot of light. Well, that's because of the trace depth. Once again, around the hair shader, there is the cortex that is heavily dependent on its transparency. So let me store this image here without increasing the trace depth. And head over to trace depth and turn it on and choose both trace depth to be 16. And if we let the image converge a little bit more, let me save it. We can see that it allows a lot more light to pass through. Okay, so let me turn off the droplets here, and I just wish to see the fur in a little bit more scrutiny. I feel like I could 1. Increase the hair count, 2. There's some dark shadows over here. I wish to account for that. And let me go to the first frame You can see that there is some kind of darkness over here. So what I learned from my experimentation is that I could go to the hair shader here and change the angle shift. So this angle shift, if you read the documentation, it's primarily meant to control where the sheen of the highlight of the hair is going to be along the curve of the hair, but adjusting that also allows us to in effect control where the shadowing might go away. So the default here is 3. Let me take a snapshot of that, and if I reduce it through the IPR, you can see that it's slowly reducing. It's not the clearest, but if I go for -3 for example, you can see that odd shadowing heavily reduced. So maybe it's natural, but for my preference I would like it to not have that much shadowing. So but if you overdo it, then maybe the hair looks like too transparent. So maybe I will keep a value of -1.5, just some slight shadowing somewhere in between. So it's the default 3, -3, and -1.5. Okay, maybe -2.5 because I'm liking the look of the colors coming through. So now I'm just going to increase the hair count here. On the hair generate node here, instead of 10,000 here, I'm just going to put 25,000. Oh, so with the increased hair count we get a bit more shadowing, so I'm just going to decrease my angle shift even more to -5, perhaps something like that. And I'm just going to turn on my droplets here to see that everything works. So let's refresh the render. Alright, they don't appear on the first frame. Let's go to frame 50. I habitually turn off the background node of my HDRIs to not see the background, but in this case there is a lot of darkness over here because it's infinite blackness. So let's turn on the background so they can see the HDRI in the reflections and refractions. Right, this is looking pretty good, and I wish to give the ground some texture, so maybe some concrete texture will help. So let's head over to maybe turn off both geometries here so it renders fast. Hang on, let's stop the render, head over to the ground and give it some UVs, UV unwrap. So for those coming from other software packages, usually when you create an object, it will give you UVs. In Houdini, it doesn't. So you gotta drop down a UV unwrap node, and by default, it gives you this little spacing over here, right? So let's turn this spacing off so it maximizes the UV grid there. Right, so that's the ground node. Head back over to the perspective camera. And on the ground, now that we have UVs, let's head over to turn on displacement and tessellation, just in case we want to add some displacement to the ground. Let's kick off the render. Just let me drop down the RS texture node to bring in the texture, and I'll head over to bring in some concrete texture. Okay, this is alright. I'll just change my scale to maybe 3 times so that the pattern is not so large. And let me check out its reflection properties here. So let me drop down another one, change it to reflection roughness and pick up the roughness map and set it to raw. It's not very apparent, but that's because there's no light hitting the surface here, but that's fine. Let me turn on both geometries now. Okay, so it appears that it is looking a little bit bright over here, and I think it's because our droplets materials are not casting shadows. So as a general optimization, renderers nowadays, they turn off the shadowing for transmissive objects. So we have to head over to the droplet material here, head over to the advanced tab and turn on the shadow opacity. So the most technically correct way is to turn on the opacity to 1 and render with caustics. But caustics is, at the time of recording, is still quite expensive to render, so let's do a 0.5 to mimic some level of shadowing, but compensated for the absence of the caustics, right? Because if it's 0, you can see here, there's no shadowing of the spheres at all. But with 1, you can see that's too strong. Technically, it should allow some light to pass through and hit these areas with caustics. But for just general optimization, setting it to 0.5 gives us the effect over here like that. So the frame is looking a little bit empty, so I'm just going to create a couple more wall planes to carve some lines over in the scene. And also perhaps I'm just going to see if I can gather some other attributes to vary the colors on the curves, and perhaps introduce a geometry here to hide the seams of these hairs picking up the ground like that, and maybe a normal map on the concrete here. So let's do the first one by making another ground plane and hitting enter on the keyboard and just rotating this by 90 degrees and moving this there. Make another copy, rotate this by 90 degrees and move this here. Let's see how that works out for us in the render. So maybe we can move the translation Y down. Perhaps something like that is healthy. And I'm just thinking that I want a lower angle view of this sphere, something like that. Might be nicer. Okay, next let's try to get the normal map in. So I have here already the roughness map, the diffuse map. If I expand this, and I'll just make another copy, set it to the normal map, and choosing this to be raw, and just interpret the information using the bump node, redshift bump, set its type to tangent space normal, and just plug it into the bump map here. And if we turn off the diffuse component now, we can see how the reflectance of this is working. Well, not the most obvious, but it's something. So I'm heading over to the redshift ROP over here and heading over to the redshift settings, because when it goes to 90 it conflicts with the other softwares that the computer is running. So let's reduce that to 60. Turn off the fur here, kick off the render, and use this click to focus tool here and click on the spheres here. And on the redshift camera tab, turn on bokeh and adjust some of the bokeh settings to your liking. And under the sampling tab, I'm just going to reduce my f-stop to 0.5 to ensure that the bokeh effect is really turned on. Yep, so it's a very shallow depth of field that can look quite cool. Just don't overdo it. So I'm just going to use value of 1.4. I think that's healthy, just some things fall into soft focus. Maybe 1 is alright. Yeah, I think I can keep it at 1. And turn on the fur again. So let's see if we can get the per clump attributes over there. So under this hair clump, if I hover over the clump ID, click on the information icon, and click on clump ID, it should visualize the clump IDs. Right, and I can use these clump IDs to vary some of the colors over here. So let's see how we can do that. So let's head over to the render view. Just hide everything else but the fur, just for optimization. Head over to our hair shading. We can potentially pull the primitive attributes using the redshift. Well, it says point attribute, but I think it will pull the primitive attributes if I just type clump ID. I think it's a small I. Well, let's verify that. Clump ID, yes, a small I. And let's plug it into the surface here to see if it pulls the information. It should be pulling the clump ID, but the clump ID is ranging from 0 to 10,000, so it's not very useful color values. So we can drop down a jitter node, and if we fit the information in between, we can see it generates different colors over here. I can use this to be all white color and turn off any kind of saturation variation. Maybe I'll pull the scalar color in here so that it's black and white. Well, anyway, I was trying to use this information to power the variance on this information here. So let's plug the hair shader back in and turn on isolate select. Save my file, because it tends to crash when we're doing dangerous shading operations on 10,000 hairs. So here, I would wish to add a color correction node after the color layer. And instead of manually adjusting my hue shift here, I would like to use this information here to power the hue shift. But the hue slider here takes a value of 0 to 360. And if I just want to get some hue variation per clump, I will need to remap these values from 0 to 1 using the range node, from 0 to 1 to say -8 to 8. Well, let me exaggerate that. -16 to 16, it will allow me to push the colors ever so slightly. So right now you can see that's quite evenly blue. Now it's varied per clump ID. So maybe 32 to -32, you can see it even clearer, right? And this is per clump ID. So I think I'm quite happy with that. And let me turn on the rest of the geometry here. Okay, I find the ground color just slightly dull, so I'm just going to head over to the ground material here. And under this base color, I'm just going to drop down a color correction. Just increase the levels a little bit by 0.5. So that's just slightly brighter, the ground. And I talked about having a geometry around the grid here, so let's do that now. With the hairs here in my scene, drop down a circle and make it onto the ground and create just 4 points. Rotate this by 45 degrees. Just size it down accordingly, so that's roughly like that. And just drop down a poly wire. That should give us a geometry like this. Maybe just bevel it slightly. Once more. some divisions in between, so you get some nice round edges here. And let's copy one from here and just call it border, and just publish this out again by heading over to here, type border. I duplicated this from the first, so let me turn off on the border, turn off render hair as polygons, we don't want that. And let's make a little material for the border. Okay, and inside this border node, let's pick up the border geometry. And let's have a look at what we have here. I think it could be slightly wider because it seems to be intersecting the hairs now. So let's head over to the circle here and just increase this thing to about here, right? And just for this border, I'm just going to reduce the tiling to 0.5 because it's based on UV space. I'm hoping to match the grid pattern over here. And whoa, by a stroke of luck, it seems to match quite closely. Right, so I think that's okay. And I'm not a big fan of this crazy value change over here, so let me adjust the model a little bit. Right, just give it some divisions here. And on this final bevel, let's exclude the flat edges. Well, I'm happy with this to be not bevel at the end. I think it looks quite okay like that. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I think in the previous episode I mentioned to render something that has got to do with the metallic flakes and also the knitting of the cloth, right? So let's get to that in the next couple of episodes. And well, I'm not sure the order of which one, but it will come eventually. I think I should talk a little bit more about building the tools in a couple of next episodes, because some of you guys coming from, let's say, Maya or C4D, you might wonder how to do some of the camera tricks over here, how to, say, create a focus null for camera to determine the camera distance. All that is kind of like not very common knowledge. There are not a lot of resources out there to tell you guys how to do this, so I think maybe see how much I can help with that so you guys can transit into Houdini as comfortably as possible. And with regards to hair rendering techniques, I've been R&Ding quite recently on the little redshift, the principled shader. I realized that it handles medulla, cortex, and cuticle components of the hair shader. It's just that it's hard-coded and it's not very well documented. So if you guys like to see how I approach getting realistic hair like you see on the screen now, if you guys are interested in that, please let me know in the comments, and then maybe you can shadow that. And also I will try to touch on using VDB to model stuff. That would be, I think, quite helpful too, coming from other packages. So hope you guys enjoyed the series so far, and thanks for those who tagged me on Instagram by showing me the stuff you create in the paper origami tutorial, the first episode there. So I love to see the work done by you guys, so thank you for posting and tagging me. I would love to share them on my socials and perhaps in the next episodes too. So let's keep this energy going. This render is so good, by the way. So another paper origami model here. There's some nice storytelling that happens in here. So thanks for trying out the tutorial and also sharing the work. So cool. I really hope you guys come up with more cool work and tag me as we go along here and as we learn together, right? Once again, this is Ronald speaking, and I'll see you in the next episode. See ya!